October 1972. Maynard, Massachusetts. A factory designed for 700 people had 12 left inside it. Not 700 on a slow day. Not 700 at the start of a shift. 700 at the moment, this building was everything it had been built to be. When the soldering irons were all lit and the test equipment was running and the line was moving and every amplifier coming off the end of it had been individually tested by a human hand before it left the building. 700 people on 15 acres in a structure so purpose-built and so precisely organized that a journalist from The Atlantic had toured it 12 years earlier and written about it with something close to reverence. 12 remained. They were not there to build anything. They were there to answer the phone when the creditors called to keep the lights on, long enough for someone to decide what happened to the name on the door and to be present when the lawyers arrived. The machines were still. The test benches were cold. The line that had produced some of the most technically precise audio equipment manufactured anywhere in the United States had gone quiet. In the same month that the company's creditors filed an involuntary bankruptcy petition in federal court. The name on the door was H. Scott. A decade earlier, that same name had been onto the faceplate of amplifiers and tuners displayed at a World's Fair in Moscow, chosen not for marketing reasons but because they represented what American precision manufacturing could do at the consumer level. A decade earlier, the Scott 299 stereo amplifier was being advertised as in use in more fine music systems than any other stereo amplifier in the world. A decade earlier, Audio Magazine had written that H. Scott equipment merited respect not only for its performance, but as a fine example of what serious engineering looked like when it was done without compromise. The man who built it was still alive. He lived 20 minutes away in Lincoln, Massachusetts. He had graduated from MIT. He had earned a doctorate. He held more than 100 American patents in noise suppression, in FM tuner design, in circuit topology, that engineers at companies far larger than his had borrowed, licensed, and in several documented cases attempted to steal. He had helped make FM radio technically viable for broadcast. He had been the reason American living rooms could hear recorded music without the ticks and pops of 78 RPM records blowing up the signal chain. He was 63 years old. His company was 12 people in a cold building. The name he had built over 25 years was about to pass to a Belgian electronics distributor he had never planned to sell to. He would be dead in 3 years. The company would leave Maynard the same year he died. The building would eventually become a storage facility, the lowest technology use imaginable for a place that had once housed the most exacting audio engineering operation in New England. The real story of H. Scott is not the bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is an event. It has a date and a filing number and a courthouse. What happened to H. Scott? Happened long before October 1972 and is still happening now in every audio store that no longer exists, in every domestic component supplier that quietly closed in the 1960s, in every tariff protection request that the federal government received from an American manufacturer and answered with silence. What does it mean when the thing you built, the standard you proved, the engineering you put your name on is not enough? If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of American instrument and audio makers, the companies that defined what sound was supposed to be and what happened to them. Subscribe if that's the kind of history you want more of. We'll be right here. Herman Hosmer Scott was not a musician. He was a signal chain man. He thought about sound the way a machinist thinks about tolerances, in terms of what is lost between the source and the listener, in terms of what the wire does to the frequency, what the resistor does to the waveform, what happens to a musical performance when it passes through a series of electrical components that were not designed with sufficient care. He had spent his early career in that gap, first in sound for motion pictures, then in the technical infrastructure of broadcast radio, and what he found there was not acceptable to him. He was born in 1909. He took his bachelor's degree at MIT in electrical engineering in 1930, his master's a year later, and went on to earn a doctorate from Lowell Technological Institute. These were not ornamental credentials. The man who would hold more than 100 patents in the field of electronics was from the beginning, someone who worked at the boundary between what the theory said was possible and what a circuit on a bench could actually be made to do. In 1947, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he founded a company he initially called the Technology Instrument Corporation. He was 38 years old. The intent, stated plainly from the beginning, was to build high-fidelity equipment for listeners who wanted something close to professional quality sound reproduction in their homes. That was not a common ambition in 1947. It was not a common product category. The American home listener of 1947 heard music through AM radio and 78 RPM records played through furniture consoles with speakers the size of a man's palm, driven by circuits that had been designed for intelligibility, not accuracy. The gap between what the musicians played in the recording studio and what came out. The other end of that furniture console was vast, and had been accepted as normal for so long that most American listeners did not recognize it as a gap at all. Scott recognized it as a problem to be solved. His first product was not an amplifier. It was a device called the binaural noise suppressor, a 13-tube, 19-inch rack-mounted unit built for commercial broadcast stations. What it did was specific and consequential. It suppressed the ticks and pops embedded in 78 RPM records enough that radio stations could put recorded music on the air without those surface noises destroying the signal. Before Scott's device, most American radio stations avoided playing records entirely. The sound was too degraded, too full of artifact to be broadcast responsibly. Live performance was safer. Live performance was what went out over the transmitter. The binaural noise suppressor changed that overnight. Every radio station that adopted it could now fill airtime with recorded music, which was cheaper to program, more varied and available around the clock in ways that live performance was not. The transition happened quickly. Live radio programs began giving way to recorded music in the late 1940s, and the mechanism that made that transition technically possible had been designed in Cambridge, Massachusetts by a man who had not set out to change the economics of American radio. He had set out to solve a signal problem. The economic consequence was a side effect. He licensed the binaural circuit to several companies, among them the Fisher Radio Company, a partnership that did not last long because Scott soon began building his own amplifiers and preamplifiers around the technology, and Fisher, which had recognized Scott as a competitor almost immediately, was correct in that assessment. These two companies, H. Scott in Cambridge and Fisher Radio in Long Island City, New York, would become the twin poles of American high-fidelity equipment for the next 2 decades. Every serious American listener in the 1950s and 1960s eventually had an opinion about which one was better. The argument itself became a kind of ongoing referendum on what American precision audio was supposed to sound like. What was missing from American living rooms before Scott was not simply quality, it was a standard. There was no shared definition of what home audio reproduction was supposed to achieve, no common measurement against which a phonograph or a radio receiver could be evaluated. The American consumer electronics industry of the 1940s was not built around the concept of accuracy. It was built around the concept of loudness, of presence, of a sound that filled a room. Fidelity, faithfulness to the original performance was a different goal entirely, and it required a different kind of engineering. Scott's company motto said it plainly: the fine things are always made by hand. That motto was not aesthetic preference. It was a manufacturing philosophy. Every H. Scott component was individually assembled, individually tested, and individually signed off before it left the building. There were no printed circuit boards in the early Scott equipment. Every connection was point-to-point wiring, individual conductors running between individual components, soldered by hand, inspected by eye. It was slower than mass production. It was more expensive. It was also the only method that allowed each unit to be verified to the same standard before it reached the listener. In 1957, Scott moved his company to Maynard, Massachusetts, a small mill town roughly 25 miles west of Cambridge in the Assabet River Valley, where a 19th-century woolen mill had once employed most of the town. The new facility was at 111 Powder Mill Road, a purpose-built modern manufacturing and research campus on a 15-acre plot of land. The history of Maynard noted at the time that H. Scott had become the first major industry in many years to build its own plant in the town. The building was described as ultra-modern. That was accurate. It had been designed for what Scott intended to do inside it: precision electronics manufacturing at scale without compromising the individual attention each unit required. The same year, Scott moved to Maynard. A 28-year-old MIT graduate named Ken Olson was founding a computer company called Digital Equipment Corporation in a renovated textile mill a few miles away. Two MIT engineers in the same small Massachusetts town in the same year, building the industries that would define the next 2 decades of American technology. Neither of them could have predicted in 1957 which one the market would protect. 3 years after the move, in May 1960, a journalist named John Conley toured the Powder Mill Road facility for The Atlantic. What he found on that factory floor was not what he had expected. He had expected machinery. What he found was craft. His guide was Victor Pomper, an MIT-trained engineer who had joined Scott in 1950 and would eventually become the company's president. Pomper knew every person on the floor by first name. The women with their soldering irons, Conley wrote, called him Vic. He knew their names in return. What this meant, Conley concluded, was that the listeners who bought H. Scott equipment did not get products assembled with fractured, cold-soldered joints. The things worked. They kept working because they had been made with devotion and with pride by people who understood that the connection between their hands and the sound that came out of the other end of the signal chain was real. That was the standard H. Scott had set in Maynard, Massachusetts in 1957. The question that standard raised, and that the decade ahead would begin to answer, was whether devotion and pride could survive in a market that was about to be restructured around neither. In the winter of 1958, a new piece of equipment appeared in American hi-fi stores that had not existed in quite that form before. It sat on the shelf between the Fisher and the Marantz. It had a brushed aluminum faceplate, a row of controls that assumed the person operating them knew what they were for, and a weight that told you something about what was inside it before you opened the chassis. The Scott 299 was a complete stereo integrated amplifier, a device that combined in a single chassis both the preamplifier stage and the power amplifier stage that most serious American listeners had previously purchased as separate units connected by cables stacked on shelves and adjusted independently. The integrated amplifier concept requires a moment of explanation because the concept is the argument. A preamplifier accepts the low-level signal coming from a turntable. A tuner or a tape deck amplifies it to line level, adjusts tone and volume, and selects between sources. A power amplifier takes that line level signal and drives it hard enough to move a speaker cone. In the early years of American hi-fi, these were separate boxes because the engineering requirements of each stage were different enough that combining them was considered a compromise. Scott's position was that it did not have to be. The 299 was the proof. Inside the chassis, 4 12AX7 tubes in the preamplifier section 2, 6BL8 driver tubes, and 4 7189 output tubes arranged in a push-pull configuration. 2 tubes handling the positive half of the audio waveform, 2 handling the negative half, their outputs combined at the output transformer to produce a single low distortion signal capable of driving any speaker the American market offered. The output transformer itself, the component that couples the high impedance tube output to the low impedance speaker, was wound to Scott's own specification. It had taps for 4 ohm, 8 ohm, and 16 ohm speaker loads. You could connect virtually any speaker made in the United States in 1958, and the 299 would drive it without complaint. 40 watts total, 20 per channel. In 1958, that was not a modest number. The preamplifier section was more elaborate than the power numbers suggested. two separate high-gain phono inputs. 36 possible equalization curves for the phono stage because in 1958 the recording industry had not yet standardized on a single equalization curve, and records pressed in Europe used different curves than records pressed in the United States, and records pressed in the 1940s used different curves than records pressed in the 1950s. The Scott 299 could accommodate all of them. A rumble filter, a high-pass circuit that removed the low-frequency mechanical noise of a turntable's motor and bearing from the signal before it reached the amplifier stage. A scratch filter, a phase reverse switch, separate dual concentric treble and bass controls. A subsonic filter that directed all available power into the audible music range rather than wasting it on frequencies below the threshold of human hearing. This was not a product designed for a listener who wanted something to fill a room with noise. This was a product designed for a listener who wanted to hear what was on the record. The build method was the same that Scott had used from the beginning: point-to-point wiring throughout, no printed circuit boards, every solder joint made by hand, every unit tested individually before it left 111 Powder Mill Road. The aluminum knobs on the production version, solid machined with a resistance in the hand that told you the potentiometer beneath them was not going to drift, became a small but specific marker of quality that the people who owned these amplifiers remembered for the rest of their lives. The name onto the faceplate was not a marketing slogan. It was a measurement. Audio Magazine evaluated the 299 and concluded that it merited respect not only for its performance, but as a fine example of good engineering and construction. That assessment mattered in 1958 in a way it is difficult to fully convey today. Audio Magazine was not a consumer lifestyle publication. It was a technical journal that had evolved into a consumer-facing review source, and its measurement methodology was taken seriously by engineers and audiophiles in equal measure. A favorable review in audio was not publicity. It was verification. The Scott 299 received it. The competing landscape in 1958 was specific. Fisher Radio, Scott's principal rival since the late 1940s, occupied a comparable position in the American hi-fi market. Comparable price, comparable quality, comparable technical ambition. Marantz, founded by Saul Marantz in Flushing, New York, was building equipment at a higher price point that some listeners considered more refined and others considered overpriced. Macintosh Laboratory, founded in Binghamton, New York, was building amplifiers that cost substantially more and were aimed at a smaller, more specialized audience. Harman Kardon was newer and was pursuing a different segment of the market. Scott's position in this landscape was precise, the most technically complete equipment at a price a serious American listener could justify. Not the cheapest, not the most expensive, the one that a working professional or a careful saver or a man who had spent 3 years in the Army and come home wanting to hear music, the way it was actually played, could put in his living room without feeling that he had settled for less than the engineering allowed. And then came the Maureen Kadvake Sonarase and Korean concept, the moment that changed everything. In 1961, Scott introduced the Model 350, the first FM stereo multiplex tuner sold in the United States. The sentence requires some unpacking because the achievement was technical before it was commercial. FM stereo multiplex, broadcasting the system by which a single FM signal could carry 2 separate audio channels, left and right, decoded by a receiver into true stereo, had been approved by the FCC that same year using the Zenith GE system. The approval was the starting gun. The question was, who would be first across the finish line with a consumer tuner capable of decoding the new signal correctly and delivering true stereo to the listener's amplifier? Scott was first by 30 days. The Model 350 arrived in American hi-fi stores within a month of the FCC's approval of the multiplex standard. It had been built in anticipation of that approval, developed in coordination with radio station WCRB in Boston, one of the first 3 FM stations in the United States to broadcast in multiplex stereo. Scott's engineers had been working with WCRB's signal before the standard was finalized, testing and refining the 350's decoding circuitry against real broadcast conditions rather than laboratory simulations. When the FCC approved the standard, the 350 was ready. What that meant for the American listener was specific and had not been possible before. A listener with a Scott 350 tuner connected to a Scott 299 amplifier driving two speakers could in 1961 tune to WCRB on a Saturday afternoon and hear a live orchestra broadcast in true stereo, the violins coming from the left speaker, the cellos from the right, the percussion centered between them, the acoustic of the hall present in the recording in a way that a mono broadcast through a furniture console could not approximate. The performance was in the room, not a representation of a performance, not a signal processed for intelligibility. The performance as the microphones in the concert hall had captured it, arriving in a living room in Maynard or Newton or Brookline through equipment built 25 miles away by people who had spent their careers thinking about nothing but that gap between the source and the listener. That gap had been closed, not by a corporation, not by a conglomerate, by an MIT engineer and his chief research engineer and the women on the powder mill road floor in a town that had once made woolen cloth and now made something more difficult and more precise. The American professional audio community noticed. Broadcast engineers, who had used Scott's binaural noise suppressor in their studios, began recommending Scott consumer equipment to musicians and producers who asked what to put in a home listening room. University sound laboratories began acquiring Scott equipment for reference use. The hi-fi stores that carried Scott gear in Boston, in New York, and Chicago, in Los Angeles, reported that the 350 created a new category of customer, the listener who had not previously considered purchasing a separate tuner, because there had been nothing worth tuning to, and who now had a reason. The name on the faceplate was a specification, and in 1961 the specification was ahead of everything else on the shelf. By 1962, there were two names an American listener heard most often when the conversation turned to serious home audio: Fisher and Scott. They were not interchangeable. The people who owned Fisher equipment and the people who owned Scott equipment had opinions about the difference, and those opinions were held with the kind of conviction usually reserved for more personal matters. The argument lived in the letters column of High Fidelity magazine, in the listening rooms of hi-fi stores from Boston to Los Angeles, in the apartments of musicians and engineers and professors, and the occasional factory worker who had saved long enough to afford something better than the console in the living room of the house he had grown up in. It was a productive argument because both sides were right about something, and the thing both sides agreed on, whether they said so or not, was that the standard these two companies had set together was the standard everything else in American hi-fi was measured against. H. Scott's product line at its peak was not a single amplifier. It was an ecosystem. The 299 series anchored the amplifier range: the 299, the 299A, the 299B, the 299C, each iteration refining the circuit, improving the noise floor, tightening the specifications. The 350 series held the tuner position, the FM multiplex tuner that had arrived first, that had been tested against real broadcast conditions rather than laboratory simulations, that had given American listeners their first experience of true stereo coming off the air. The LK series offered the same Scott engineering in kit form: the LK72, an 80-watt stereo tube integrated amplifier sold unassembled for the technically literate listener who wanted Scott's circuit topology at a lower price point and was willing to do the soldering himself. The console lines carried names drawn from Boston area geography: Copley, Exeter, Berkeley, Andover, Carlisle. Complete music systems in wooden cabinets with turntables and speakers integrated, aimed at the listener who wanted a single object rather than a component stack. Each of these products carried the same manufacturing commitment: point-to-point, wiring, individual testing, the standard that had been established at 111 Powder Mill Road and had never been relaxed. By the mid-1960s, approximately 700 people worked on that 15-acre campus in Maynard. They were not anonymous. Victor Pomper, the MIT engineer who had joined Scott in 1950 and risen to the presidency, knew the floor well enough that the assemblers called him Vic, the women who did the soldering, and it was largely women, a detail that the trade press of the period seldom noted and the historical record has not honored adequately, had developed hand skills that took years to acquire and that could not be transferred to a different process without losing something the measurements would eventually catch. A cold solder joint on a printed circuit board is a defect. A cold solder joint in a point-to-point wiring harness is a defect that a trained eye can find and correct before the unit leaves the building. The training of that eye was not a corporate policy. It was a culture. It lived in the hands of the people on the floor, and it had been built over nearly 2 decades of doing the same thing to the same standard every day in the same building. In 1967, Scott expanded that building. A new wing was added to the Powder Mill Road facility, additional manufacturing space, additional research capacity. The physical expression of a company that believed it was going to need more room. The expansion was completed around the time the company's sales were approaching their peak. It was in retrospect the last major capital commitment H. Scott would make to American manufacturing. At the time, it looked like confidence. At the time, it was confidence. In 1968, H. Scott's annual sales topped $15 million. $15 million in 1968, the equivalent of roughly $140 million today, 700 employees, 15 acres, a product line that ran from entry-level kit amplifiers to precision tuners that broadcast engineers recommended to their colleagues. A brand that had been reviewed favorably in every significant American audio publication, that had been displayed at a World's Fair, that had been adopted by university sound laboratories and professional recording facilities, alongside its use in the living rooms and listening rooms of the American middle class. And in the spring of that same year, the year of peak sales, the year the factory was running at its fullest, the Maynard Beacon ran a headline that no company at the peak of its confidence should have needed. H. Scott denies rumors it will close. The headline was not alarmist journalism. It was a response to something that people in Maynard were already saying out loud. Victor Pomper addressed it directly into the article. He acknowledged the slowdown. He attributed it, in the first instance, to what he called an inflationary recession courtesy of the United States government. That was a reasonable characterization of the economic conditions of 1968. The Vietnam War was consuming federal spending at a rate that was beginning to overheat the domestic economy, and discretionary purchases like precision audio equipment were among the first categories to soften when household budgets tightened. Pomper was not wrong about that, but he named a second cause in the same breath, and the second cause was the one that mattered more, and the one that no domestic monetary policy was going to fix. Japanese competition. He said it plainly. He said the company was suing several Japanese firms for patent infringement. He said Scott needed help, federal help, tariff protection, import injury relief, and that without it, the competitive pressure from Japanese manufacturers was going to be difficult to sustain against. The help did not come. To understand what Pomper was describing, it is necessary to understand what had happened to the American hi-fi market between 1961 and 1968. The 7 years between the Model 350's introduction and the Beacon headline. Those 7 years were not a period of stable competition. They were a period of structural change that the American audio industry, including H. Scott, had watched arriving and had not found a way to stop. The Japanese electronics industry had been present in the American market since the early 1960s. The first wave was not threatening to Scott directly budget-priced imports sold through catalog distributors and department stores aimed at a price point well below what Scott occupied. A teenager could buy a Japanese-made transistor radio for $4 in 1962. That was not competition for the Scott 299. But the same engineering capability that produced $4 transistor radios was being redirected systematically and with substantial Japanese government backing toward the upper end of the consumer electronics market. Sony, Pioneer, Panasonic, Sansui, Toshiba. These were not small operations running on thin margins and learning as they went. They were large, well-capitalized, government-supported industrial enterprises that had identified the American premium audio market as a target and were allocating engineering resources to take it. The specific mechanism of the threat was not mysterious. It was structural. H. Scott purchased every component it used from American domestic suppliers, every resistor, every capacitor, every tube, every transformer, every length of wire. This was not accidental. It was a commitment stated and maintained to American manufacturing throughout the supply chain. The cost of that commitment was embedded in every unit that left 111 Powder Mill Road. Japanese manufacturers operated under a different cost structure, lower labor rates, lower environmental compliance costs, significant government export subsidies, and a domestic market protected by import barriers that American manufacturers could not equivalently access. The result was not a small price advantage, it was a structural cost gap that widened every year as Japanese production scaled and their component sourcing became more efficient. By the mid-1960s, a Japanese-built receiver, a single unit combining tuner preamplifier and power amplifier, could be purchased at an American retail store for less than the Scott 299 amplifier alone. The Japanese unit was not in 1965 equivalent in performance or build quality to the Scott. The point-to-point wiring, the individually tested output transformers, the 36 equalization curves of the Scott preamplifier, none of that existed in the Japanese receiver at that price. But the gap was closing. Every year it closed further, and the Japanese manufacturers were not standing still. What H. Scott had built its market position on was the argument that precision mattered. That the difference between a Scott-built amplifier and a mass-produced receiver was audible, measurable, and worth paying for. That argument was credible as long as the performance gap justified the price gap. The moment the Japanese engineering caught up to the point where the performance gap was no longer clearly audible to a listener in a store, not to a trained engineer with measurement equipment, but to a listener in a store, more in the 20 minutes between walking through the door and making a purchasing decision, the price gap became the only argument left. And the price gap was not one Scott could win. This was the terrain Pomper was describing in the spring of 1968. Not a slump, not a cycle, a structural displacement that was already underway and accelerating. What makes the H. Scott story something other than a straightforward account of market competition is what happened, or more precisely, what did not happen at the policy level. Pomper went to Washington. Scott's position was documented, argued, and presented to the federal government, an American manufacturer buying American components, employing American workers, building precision equipment that had helped define what American consumer electronics meant to the world, was being undercut by foreign competitors who operated under cost structures that American law and American wages made impossible to replicate. The request was specific tariff protection or import injury relief or some form of trade policy intervention that would give American manufacturers the time and the margin to remain competitive while the structural adjustment was worked out. The federal government did not act. There was no conspiracy in that silence. There was no single decision, no named official who reviewed the Scott petition and chose to deny it. There was the ordinary inertia of a trade policy apparatus that was managing competing interests, consumer groups who wanted lower prices, import-exporters who wanted market access defense industries, that had their own claims on congressional attention in 1968, and that did not in the event prioritize the survival of a precision audio manufacturer in a small Massachusetts mill town. The 1968 sales peak of $15 million was real. The 1967 factory expansion was real. The 700 people on the Powder Mill Road floor were real. And the forces that were going to make all of it unsustainable were also real, and had been arriving for years. And the company's president had named them in the town newspaper and asked for help, and received none. What does it mean when the standard you proved is not enough to save you. It means the story is not over at the peak. It means the peak is where the real story begins. Between 1968 and 1972, the distance between what H. Scott had been and what it was becoming collapsed faster than the public record fully captures. The Maynard Beacon headline from the spring of 1968, the denial, the reassurance, the 7% behind, and hoping to make it up in the summer, turned out to be the last moment of public optimism the company would be able to sustain. Pomper's attribution of the slowdown to government-induced recession was not dishonest. The inflationary pressure of 1968 was real. But recessions end. What Pomper also knew, and what the trade press was beginning to document with increasing specificity, was that the Japanese competition he had named in the same breath as the recession was not a cyclical phenomenon. It did not respond to interest rate adjustments. It did not soften when the domestic economy recovered. It compounded. Sony had entered to the American consumer electronics market not as a novelty, but as an engineering proposition. The company had spent the late 1950s and early 1960s building the technical credibility that allowed it to make that proposition with a straight face. The TR-63 transistor radio, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, had established in 1957 that Japanese electronics manufacturing was not a synonym for cheap imitation. By the mid-1960s, Sony was producing reel-to-reel tape recorders, portable televisions, and high-fidelity components that American audio reviewers were evaluating on their merits, rather than dismissing on their origin. Pioneer was building integrated amplifiers and tuners with specifications that matched the Scott line at prices that undercut it by 30 to 40% at American retail. Sansui, Panasonic, Toshiba. Each of them was advancing along the same trajectory, each year's product line, a measurable step closer to the quality level that Scott had spent 2 decades establishing as the American standard. The May 10, 1971 cover of Time magazine depicted a Sony television held by a gloved hand, the sleeve decorated like an American flag. The headline read, "How to Cope with Japan's Business Invasion." It was not the first warning. It was the warning that had finally made it to a mass-market magazine cover, which meant it was approximately a decade behind what the people on the Powder Mill Road floor already knew from looking at the store shelves. Scott's engineering response to the competitive pressure was genuine. The company was not standing still. The transition from vacuum tube circuits to transistors, which had been a generational shift across the entire American electronics industry through the mid-1960s, had been navigated at Maynard with the same care that Scott brought to everything else. The solid-state amplifiers that emerged from the Powder Mill Road facility in the late 1960s were competent products, technically sound, built to the same manufacturing standard as the tube equipment that had established the brand. The console lines Copley, Exeter, Berkeley, Andover, Carlisle carried Scott's name into living rooms that might not have purchased a component system, reaching listeners who wanted a complete music system rather than a stack of separate units. But the transition created a problem that engineering alone could not solve. The vacuum tube equipment, the 299 series, the LK72, the 350 tuner, had a sonic character that was specific, describable, and that listeners recognized as distinctively Scott. The point-to-point wiring, the output transformer specifications, the particular way the 7189 output tubes behaved when pushed toward their operating limits. These produced a mid-range warmth and a controlled low-frequency extension that the audio and high-fidelity reviewers had documented, and that the buyers who chose Scott over Fisher or Marantz had chosen it for. The transition to solid-state circuitry changed that character. Not for the worse, necessarily. The measurements often improved. Distortion figures dropped. Frequency response extended. Signal-to-noise ratios widened. But the character that had been the emotional argument for Scott equipment, the quality that had made the brand something more than a specification sheet, was no longer the same thing it had been. And the Japanese solid-state equipment, by the early 1970s, was producing measurement figures that matched or exceeded Scott's solid-state line at a price that Scott's domestic cost structure made impossible to answer. The headcount decline tells the story in the plainest terms. 700 people in 1967 at the peak of the factory expansion in the year before the Beacon headline. 500 in the spring of 1968 when Pomper gave his interview. The number continued to fall through 1969, 1970, and 1971, not in a single dramatic layoff, but in the accumulated arithmetic of a company that was losing market share faster than it was finding ways to reduce costs, and that had committed as a matter of stated principle to maintaining American domestic manufacturing throughout the process. That commitment was not naive. It was a bet that the federal government would eventually recognize what was happening to American electronics manufacturers and act to address the structural trade imbalance that was driving it. Pomper had made the case. Scott had made the case. Other American audio manufacturers had made the case. The case was accurate. The cost disadvantage was documented. The Japanese government support for export manufacturing was real and had been reported in the American trade press since the mid-1960s. The bet lost. By the fall of 1972, the component suppliers that Scott depended on for domestic sourcing were beginning to fail. Not all of them, and not all at once, but enough of them, and in the specific categories that Scott's manufacturing process required, that the supply chain that had supported 111 Powder Mill Road for 15 years was no longer reliable. When a key supplier could not deliver and sued for money owed, the fragility of Scott's financial position became impossible to manage from the inside. The company had been running on diminishing capital for years. There was no reserve left to absorb the disruption. In October 1972, H. Scott terminated production. Not wound down, not restructured, terminated. The line stopped. The test benches went cold. The soldering irons went dark. 410 people were still employed at Maynard when the termination was announced. After the announcement, 12 remained the minimum necessary to keep the corporate entity legally functional, while the bankruptcy process ran its course. The other 398 went home. Among them, approximately 250 women from the assembly, testing, and packaging floor. Approximately 100 of those women were military wives from Fort Devens, the Army base, 8 miles north of Maynard, where their husbands were stationed. Some of them recently returned from Vietnam, some of them still there. These women had come to the Powder Mill Road floor because it was skilled work, steady work that paid, and that required something of the person doing it. They had built the Scott standard with their hands. They had been the last line of quality assurance between the circuit on the bench and the listener in the living room. They left in October 1972 without ceremony, without public acknowledgement, and without, as far as the historical record shows, any significant notice from the American audio press that had spent 2 decades praising the products those hands had made. In November 1972, several of Scott's creditors filed a petition for involuntary bankruptcy under Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Act. Scott responded by filing its own petition for reorganization under Chapter 1. The distinction mattered legally. Chapter 9 was liquidation territory, creditors taking control assets. Sold, the corporate entity dissolved. Chapter 20 was reorganization, the possibility, however thin, that the company could be restructured, refinanced, and returned to operation. Pomper chose Chapter 20. He was still in November 1972 trying to save something. His public statement at the time was precise and, under the circumstances, remarkable for its composure. "We've not gone down the tubes," he told the Maynard Beacon. He described the reorganization plan the company would acquire: computerized automation equipment that would slash direct labor costs by up to 70%. It would emerge leaner, more competitive, capable of meeting the Japanese price point without abandoning American manufacturing entirely. That statement requires a moment of honest accounting. A 70% reduction in direct labor costs was not a restructuring. It was a reckoning with the fact that the hand labor model, the women with the soldering irons, the individual testing the point-to-point construction that had been the physical basis of the Scott standard since 1947 was the thing that had to go. The engineering would survive. The name would survive. The building would survive at least for a while. But the manufacturing philosophy that had produced the 299 and the 350 and the LK72, the philosophy encoded in the company motto that had been on Scott's letterhead since the beginning, that philosophy could not survive a 70% labor cost reduction. The fine things had always been made by hand. The reorganization plan required that they no longer be. Pomper never managed to execute the reorganization. The financing did not materialize. The creditors who had filed the Chapter 1 petition were not persuaded by the Chapter 2 argument, and the new lenders Pomper needed to fund the automation investment could not be secured on terms that allowed the company to continue operating while the transition was made. The window between the Arrington team to the bankruptcy filing in November 1972 and the point at which the company's remaining assets would be claimed by creditors was not long enough to close. In January 1973, H.H. Scott Inc. was acquired by SMA International, a Belgian electronics company based in Brussels that had been Scott's European licensee. SMA had the advantage of an existing relationship with the Scott organization, existing access to Scott's product designs and specifications, and an existing distribution network in Europe that gave the Scott name value beyond the American market. The acquisition price has not been confirmed in the available record. What is confirmed is that the company's American ownership ended in January 1973, 26 years after Herman Scott had founded it in Cambridge, and that production at the Maynard facility resumed under Belgian ownership in February 1973. Herman Scott himself had already retired. The records indicate he stepped back from the company in 1972 before the bankruptcy filing. The precise timing is not fully documented, but the Audio Engineering Society's obituary notes his retirement that year. He did not sell the company in the conventional sense. He did not negotiate a sale to a buyer of his choosing, did not receive a purchase price that reflected what the company had been at its peak, did not hand the keys to someone he had vetted and approved. He retired from a company that was already in financial distress, and the company was then acquired by its Belgian licensee out of bankruptcy proceedings. The founder's exit and the company's collapse were not separate events that happened to coincide. They were the same event experienced from two different vantage points. He was 63 years old. The Belgian ownership produced equipment under the Scott name through the mid-1970s. Some of it was technically creditable. The SYMA-era Scott products are not, without defenders among collectors, and the European manufacturing context brought its own engineering competence to the task. But the American manufacturing thread was broken. The powder mill road floor, the individually tested units, the women whose hands had been the quality standard that was gone. What SYMA produced under the Scott name was a different thing wearing a familiar label. Between 1973 and 1975, the company's operations migrated from Maynard to Woburn, Massachusetts, a town north of Boston closer to the distribution infrastructure that a company in reorganization needed. The 15-acre campus at 111 Powder Mill Road was vacated. The building that had been built specifically for H.H. Scott, purpose-designed, purpose-constructed, the physical embodiment of what the company intended to do and how it intended to do it, was left behind. Herman Hosmer Scott died on April 13, 1975 in Lincoln, Massachusetts. He was 66 years old. The cause of death is not recorded in the sources available. What is recorded is the timing, the same year his company left Maynard, the same year the campus at 111 Powder Mill Road was vacated, the same year the last physical connection between H.H. Scott and the town it had inhabited for 17 years was severed. The man and the place left in the same year. Whether that coincidence carries meaning is not a question the historical record can answer. It is a question the timing raises without resolving. The equipment continued under the Scott name for another decade. In 1985, Emerson Electronics purchased the H. Scott brand. Not the company, not the factory, not the engineering team or the manufacturing process or the accumulated institutional knowledge of 25 years of precision audio manufacturing. The brand, the name, the two letters, and the surname of a man who had been dead for 10 years and who had held more than 100 American patents and who had been making FM radio technically viable for broadcast. While most of the American electronics industry was still focused on AM, Emerson Radio is at its core a brand licensing and consumer electronics distribution company. It does not manufacture. It sources products primarily from Asia and brings them to market under its own brand and under licensed brands that carry name recognition the company considers commercially valuable. The H. Scott name was commercially valuable. It was recognized. It had history. It had the specific kind of recognition that an audience of American consumers in their 50s and 60s, people who had grown up with Scott equipment in their parents' living rooms, or who had owned Scott components themselves in the 1960s, would respond to at the point of purchase. That recognition was the asset Emerson purchased in 1985. What Emerson did not purchase, what could not be purchased because it no longer existed in transferable form, was the standard the name had once represented. The production stopped in October 1972. The founder retired the same year. The Belgian licensee took the name to Woburn. The founder died in 1975. The campus was vacated. The name was sold in 1985. The standard had been gone for 13 years by then. Nobody announced its departure. Nobody filed a petition for its reorganization. It simply was not there anymore. And the market, which had not protected it when it was alive, did not mourn it when it was gone. The H. Scott name exists today. It is on a Bluetooth hands-free car speakerphone sold under the Emerson Radio brand on Amazon. The device clips to a vehicle's sun visor. It announces incoming callers by number. It streams music wirelessly from a paired phone. It costs less than $20. The product listing describes it as convenient. That word convenient does not appear anywhere in the H. Scott Company motto. The motto was the fine things are always made by hand. The speakerphone is not made by hand. It is not made in America. It is not made to a standard that Herman Hosmer Scott would have recognized as continuous with anything he built at 111 in Powder Mill Road. This is the hollow revival in its most complete form, not a brand that was acquired and compromised, not a name that was licensed onto a lesser version of the original product, a name that was detached entirely from the thing it had named, from the engineering philosophy, from the manufacturing method, from the specific human skills that had produced the specific sonic result, and reattached to a consumer convenience product in a category that did not exist when the company was alive. The name survived. The standard did not. The collector market has rendered its verdict on that distinction with the directness that markets apply when they are not being managed. On Reverb.com and eBay, restored H. Scott 299 amplifiers, the units that came off the Powder Mill Road floor between 1958 and 1972, hand-wired, individually tested, built to the specification that Audio Magazine had called a fine example of serious engineering, sell for prices that bear no relationship to their original retail cost in inflation-adjusted terms. A fully restored 299C with matched output tubes and recapped power supply commands, prices that reflect not nostalgia but function. Working musicians, recording engineers, and dedicated listeners are paying those prices because the equipment does something that current production does not do in quite the same way, and because the people who have compared the two have concluded that the difference is real and worth the premium. The Audio Karma community, the online forum where vintage audio enthusiasts share restoration techniques, source replacement components, and document the condition of surviving units, has accumulated decades of institutional knowledge about H. Scott equipment that the company itself no longer exists to provide. The forum members know which capacitors to replace and in what order. They know which output tube types are compatible substitutes for the original 7189s, which are now scarce, and what the sonic trade-offs of each substitution are. They know which production runs of the 299 have the preferred solid aluminum knobs and which have the later plastic versions. This knowledge is held collectively informally in a digital space that did not exist when the equipment was built, maintained by people who were not born when the Powder Mill Road floor was operating, who never walked through the door at Maynard, and who are nonetheless the closest thing to a quality assurance function that H. Scott equipment has today. The secondary market is not a monument. It is a judgment. When original American-made H. Scott equipment sells for multiples of its inflation-adjusted original price, while current production equipment bearing the Scott name sells for less than $20, the market is not expressing sentiment. It is expressing a conclusion about what the name was worth when the standard behind it was real, and what the name is worth now that the standard is gone. A specific concrete reason the original equipment remains in active use among serious listeners is not difficult to state. A restored Scott 299 with its original point-to-point wiring intact and its output transformers operating within their design parameters produces a mid-range reproduction character, a quality of presence in the although in the upper bass and lower mid-range frequencies that acoustic instruments occupy, that the solid-state integrated amplifiers at comparable current price points do not replicate in the same way. This is not because the circuit is secret. The schematics are freely available. It is because the tolerance stack of 60-year-old components individually selected and matched at 111 Powder Mill Road interacts with the output transformer geometry in ways that are specific to that construction method and that current automated manufacturing does not reproduce. Session musicians in Boston and New York still seek these units out for specific recording applications. The equipment is working. It is not a relic. It is a tool that does its job in a way that nothing currently in production does quite the same way at any price. The address at 111 Powder Mill Road, Maynard, Massachusetts, is still there. The building is still there. The structure that was designed specifically for H. Scott, the purpose-built modern facility on 15 acres that the history of Maynard had noted with civic pride, in 1957 the campus where 700 people once made some of the most precisely engineered audio equipment produced anywhere in the United States is still standing. The expansion wing added in 1967 at the peak of the company's confidence is still attached to it. It is a storage facility, the lowest technology use imaginable for a building that once housed the most exacting audio engineering operation in New England. Not a museum, not a technology park, not a makerspace or a research facility, or even an office building. A warehouse. The kind of building where things are put when they are not being used. The irony is almost too complete to dwell on, except that it is not irony. It is the literal outcome of the story. The place where precision was made now stores things that require no precision at all. There is one more detail that belongs in this account, and it arrives 25 years after the end. On January 6, 2000, at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, the Consumer Technology Association inducted the first 50 pioneers into its Consumer Electronics Hall of Fame. The names on that inaugural list were not obscure. Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Guglielmo Marconi, Philo Farnsworth, Avery Fisher, Sidney Harmon, Henry Kloss, James B. Lansing, Saul Marantz, David Sarnoff, Edwin Howard Armstrong, and Herman Hosmer Scott. He had been dead for 25 years. His company had been a brand name on imported consumer electronics for 15 of those years. The building where he had done his best work was a storage facility. The name he had built was on a car speakerphone, and 25 years after his death, the industry he had helped create placed him alongside Edison and Tesla and acknowledged formally and in public that the work he had done in Cambridge and Maynard, Massachusetts between 1947 and 1972 had been foundational to the consumer electronics world that the people in that Las Vegas convention hall were there to celebrate. The recognition was accurate. It was also 25 years too late to matter to the man, and arrived in the same decade that the company motto, "The fine things are always made by hand," was being applied to a Bluetooth speakerphone, manufactured in Asia and sold for under $20 on the internet. What H. Scott's story reveals is not a mystery. It is a pattern, one that repeats in American manufacturing history with enough regularity that it should not surprise anyone who has been paying attention, and that surprises everyone anyway when it arrives in a specific place, at a specific company with specific names attached to it. Precision engineering culture in America is not self-sustaining. It requires an ecosystem-trained craftsmen who have spent years developing hand skills that cannot be acquired in a classroom. Domestic component suppliers whose own businesses depend on the same manufacturing base. A federal trade policy willing to protect the investment in domestic production long enough for American manufacturers to compete on quality rather than being forced to compete on price alone against foreign producers operating under structurally different cost conditions. When any one of those elements fails, the others cannot compensate indefinitely. Scott had the engineers. Scott had the craftsmen. Scott had the standard. The component supply chain began to erode. The trade policy protection never arrived. The standard outlasted the infrastructure that had made it possible by approximately 4 years from the moment it was no longer financially sustainable to the moment it actually stopped. Victor Pomper told to the Maynard Beacon in 1972 that the company had not gone down the tubes. He was right in the narrow sense. The tubes had gone out of the amplifiers years earlier, replaced by transistors in the industry's transition to solid state. But the standard those tubes had been built to, the standard that had made Audio Magazine call a Scott amplifier a fine example of serious engineering, that had made a journalist from the Atlantic write about the factory floor with something close to reverence, that had made the women of Fort Devens spend their working days building something precise and lasting and worth building. That standard had gone somewhere. Not down the tubes, into the units, into the surviving 299s and 350s and LK72s that are still being powered up in listening rooms and home studios and the back rooms of small recording spaces across the northeastern United States. The standard is in the equipment. The equipment is still working. The building is a warehouse. The name is a speakerphone. And somewhere in a listening room in New England, a restored Scott 299 is doing exactly what the women on the Powder Mill Road floor built it to do, holding the signal, driving the speaker, producing in the space between two loudspeakers the specific presence of a musical performance that Herman Hosmer Scott spent his entire career trying to deliver from the source to the listener without losing anything on the way. He mostly succeeded. The market did not reward him for it. The Hall of Fame eventually acknowledged it. The equipment is still the proof. See you in the next one.